So these are the parts that I'm going to install that connect to the oil cooler, and it includes the filter assembly and this cover that fits on the engine block. This cover contains a thermostat which controls the oil flow through the cooler, and it also has a square ring that fits in the back to help seal that assembly, and it attaches to the engine block with 3 of these bolts. Now the oil filter's hinged to make it easy to get in and out because you sort of bump into the frame, and these 2 banjo bolts and 4 copper washers are used to seal the hoses from the oil cooler. Now when you mount the cover, there's an O-ring that has to go in, and this is often referred to as the $2,000 O-ring. The reason for that is if it fails, the engine will basically get no oil. So back in 1983, an engine cost you about $2,000, a lot more than that today. And underneath that will go some shims, and there's a number that you need to compute based on a distance between the oil canister and the top of the engine block. And I'll show how I do that in a minute. So this is what I use to make the measurements to determine how many shims I need between the oil filter cover and the engine block. I use this depth gauge to get the depth of the canister from the block, and then I use a vernier caliper to measure more precisely what that depth is. The other thing I like to do is measure the thickness of the shims. They should be 0.3 millimeters, but I don't trust things, so I always measure them to make sure they're very close to that. And the O-ring is supposed to be 4 millimeters. Likewise, I don't trust that. So I measure it, and measuring rubber is of course a lot of fun. So I just kind of tighten up the anvil just to where I can barely move it. And if the reading is anywhere close to 4 millimeter, then this is the right thickness O-ring. So I cleaned up the oil cooler and polished up the fittings and have it loosely mounted to the frame here. And then these are the hoses that will connect to the threaded holes on the oil filter cover and temperature controlled valve. And the banjo bolts are what go in there to hold the cooler lines on. So this is where the oil filter cover mounts to the engine block, and this is where the cylindrical filter slides into the canister. And you can see the lip of the canister is recessed from the face here. And that's the depth I want to measure with my depth gauge. And the way I do that is I hold it flat against the block and then slide the measuring rod in tight to the canister lip and lock it with the set screw. And then I use the vernier caliper to get the measurement here, which is much more precise than the depth gauge markings are. And then I'll take a set of measurements, 1, 2, 3, 4 around the perimeter, and average those to get the depth of the canister. I need to ensure that the white O-ring is compressed enough to seal the edge of the oil filter canister and the oil filter cover. So I use this formula, and it computes the percentage compression of the O-ring. And the target range is from 10% to 25% of the original thickness. The terms in the formula are O, which is the white O-ring diameter, and that's 4 millimeters. S, that's the thickness of a shim, which is 0.3 millimeters. C is the cover gasket thickness, except you hardly ever use a cover gasket, so it's 0 in this case. And D is the distance I measured from the top of the canister to the engine block, which was based on the average of the 4 measurements I took. To help me figure out the number of shims, I made a little spreadsheet. Up at the top is a picture of the canister and the 4 measurement points. Over to the left of that is the measurements I took and the average value. Then the formula shows the values for O, S, C, and D is the average value I computed for the canister depth. And then I also show the actual measurements I got for the O-ring diameter and the shim thickness. Then I plugged those values into the formula and added the number of shims. So for 1 shim, the compression for my canister would be 5%, 2 shims would be 13%, and 3 shims would be 21% of the original O-ring diameter. To be conservative, I'm going to use 3 shims. So I install the hinged oil filter. One end has a rubber gasket, but the other end doesn't. And the rubber gasket end goes in to the back of the block like that. Now I put a little bit of axle grease on the 3 shims, and I want to verify I've got 3. I do. And it just helps keep them together and not shift around. And then the other thing I like to do is put the O-ring on the cover. It holds it in place, so that makes it a lot easier to install. And then it'll slide on like that. And then I thread in the 3 bolts with wave washers. Now I like to use Allen bolts because they're a lot easier to get to when you have to pull the filter out than the hex head bolts that are typically installed. So that's my preference. I just change those out for Allen's. So I'll install all 3 of those, and then the cover will be on the oil filter and attached to the block. So I'm ready to install the oil lines on the cooler, and I loosened up the fittings here a little bit so I can rotate the banjo bolt ends so they'll be flush with the oil filter cover. Now this one, which is the left side, will go to the outside, and the right side will go to the inside. The banjo bolts get a washer, and then they go through the fitting, and then there's a second washer on the other side, and then they thread into the block here. So that's basically how they mount. Now I'm going to torque the banjo bolts to 13 foot-pounds, but that's kind of low, so I'm using an inch-pound wrench at 156 to torque them up. There we go. And they're ready to go. Now I tightened up the fittings here and tightened up the mounting bracket on the oil cooler. So it's all set to go and connected to the thermostat, and we've got a new oil filter in.